Almost 3 years has passed. Now what? So guys, this is an update on the EMP event, the aftermath of an EMP. I did 4 installments, if you will. This is the final one, and this is more of an update on everything that happened over the past 3 years. Now, a lot of things have gotten better, but not quite there yet. Though 90% of most Americans did pass away, give or take. We'll never know the true numbers, because what we found out during the last 2 years that passed, people switched identity and people completely fell off the grid, hiding out in woodland areas and things like that. And we don't know the percentage of those people that went hiding out there, but we know that we counted them as missing. So there was that. Now, 90% of the population, like I said, give or take, it's either less or a little more. But obviously, what added to that 90% was also the people that went missing and were hiding out, and to this day, probably don't want to be discovered. Now, a lot of people did pass away from starvation and disease. Disease was the bigger problem, and then infections from those people who got cut from working around their farms, homesteads, or at home. There was an increase in violence about 2.5 years ago, where people were starving and were doing what they had to do to make sure that their families could eat. And that started rivalries in different areas and rivalries between neighbors, towns, and cities. So we had a lot of that going on. We had a ton of infighting. The government, which was still pretty intact, was able to intervene in a lot of it, but not all of it. So we did have a lot of people essentially pass away from that. Now, as it currently goes, the United States is in an all-out war with China, who is trying to take over the western half of the United States. Now, we were able to push them back greatly due to the help of other nations stepping in and helping us out. Nonetheless, there is negotiations on the table right now, and it looks like the Chinese might be folding and just giving up the rest of the West, though whoever settled in the United States, they might be able to stay. That remains to be seen. We're going to have to wait on that down the line. But a lot of interesting shit had gone down as well. Now, we do have power back to most of the country, not all of the country. There are states who wanted nothing to do with help, which was weird. Texas was one of them, but they had their own grid system, which they got up and running first. And they had an influx of, if you will, people traveling to Texas because the power was back. But the power's back to, I would say, 90% of the country. Now, the infighting that I was talking about earlier, there were a lot of communities that were being affected. They had prepper communities who were ready for this, ready to rock and roll. They were being attacked on almost a daily basis by a lot of marauders, right? So people who needed food and supplies, they went to these essentially homing beacons or lighthouse of savior, which were a lot of the prepper communities and homesteads. Now, there were homesteads that were also built and buried or tucked back in forests and woods. They seem to have done a lot better. But those that were left in the open or on hilltops, they were attacked almost constantly. Some of them had great security. Some of them crumbled because they didn't have enough security. Some of them had infighting within their own communities, and that fell apart, and therefore let the floodgates open and let people in. So there was a lot of that was going on. A lot of communities wind up failing. The communities that held the strongest were the ones that had better support, training, and even had the mutual support of other prepper communities in the surrounding areas. So they tend to have done a lot better as far as protection goes. But a lot of the weirdo cult ones, they folded like cheap suits, or origami, if you will, under pressure, because they didn't have real support, and they thought that just because they followed the book, the Bible, that was going to save them, when in fact it didn't. There were other groups that were non-violent groups, or no guns in our community. They folded first because they had no way of protecting themselves. A lot of the bigger cities obviously fell abandoned for whatever reason. New York hung in there. A lot of New Yorkers wind up banding together as buildings, and buildings became almost like countries or states because they weren't allowing anybody in, and they were definitely fighting for the food and resources they had. Now, the buildings that tended to have done better were the sky rises, or high rises, excuse me, or skyscrapers that were old school, built out of like metal, steel, and concrete. Other buildings that tried it, they were burned out of their homes or buildings, because a lot of those buildings, the smaller ones, the 5, 6 stories, they're made of mostly timber. And those things went up like that. There was no fire department to put them out, though the bucket brigades were formed, but there was nothing that can be done. There was no police for about almost 2 years to 2.5 years in the city. They established some kind of law and order, but even with cities like New York and Detroit, they're still fighting the violent element or gang element. But nonetheless, for whatever reason, they held their own. Now, some cities were completely abandoned. Some bigger towns and smaller cities were completely abandoned. And then there were new towns formed out of the necessity of needing to put people somewhere, and communities that gathered together left the city or town and formed their own, again, city, or rather their towns. No new cities have been built yet, but people are slowly, from what I'm hearing over the radio, are starting to go back to these abandoned cities and trying to establish some kind of society. Now, being that a large percentage of people did pass away, that's going to be hard to do. So yeah, when America first started, that's pretty much the numbers we're at right now. And people are trying to stretch themselves thin to start up and move to new areas. They're going to wind up failing, though I haven't heard anybody fail yet, but they're going to wind up failing because there's just not enough people to run these places. There was a religious group that was roaming the nation. They were trying to save everybody by way of the Bible, which again wasn't a bad thing. But you had another group, a notorious group. They were called Save the Nation. They were running around forcing people to believe in their book, and then they were also offing people at the same time. So we, the United States, had run-ins with these people, and these people were true cultists. They weren't like religious Bible thumpers. They were cultists that were running around forcing people to believe in their religion. They wind up being snuffed out almost completely. I heard that there's a small group that's still around trying to save the nation, minus the violence that they were instilling and forcing upon people when they were in a larger group. They reached a number of 20,000. They're down to, I think, probably 2,000-3,000 now. They were either demolished, killed, or in some cases, which was rare, they were convinced that that wasn't the way. So we had that. Violence obviously spiked at one point, but now it's back down. Well, it's lower than it was 2.5 years ago. We also had major increase in slavery and sex trafficking, because there was nothing to check that and that kind of crime. There was nothing that could be done, and it's still going on to this day, and there's nothing that can be done. The new president of the United States stated that there's nothing that can be done because they don't have the manpower to stop it. But they urge citizens to step in if they see it, and that has been happening a lot. So citizens are back to patrolling their own country, if you will, and stopping things where they see fit. Yes, there has been an element of racism that has popped back up again, but such is life. This is new America, and we are rebuilding pretty much from the ashes of everything that was destroyed. So with the racism that's going on, people like myself, we have to be careful of where we go. But again, I don't have a problem with it because I know where I can go and where I can't. Now, for everybody else in the country, there are still the racism I'm also talking about. There are black communities that will not allow white people in, and there are white people that will not allow black people in. So I guess it's sort of even, if you will. We had a brief problem with cannibalism, and cannibalism was being dealt with in two ways. There were one group of people, or if you were found to be part of a group of people that were eating other people out of a necessity because you were starving, you were given a pass, if you will. And in some cases, depending on the state, you were given some jail time, but not a lot. But there were other people who continued to eat people even after society was sort of established like it is now, because they liked the taste of human meat so much, they kept eating it. Those people were put to death almost immediately. Now, the judicial system is not fair. It never was. It's even worse now, because with cannibalism, you're almost automatically expelled. It is what it is. That's the new society we live in. I know some people are like, I can't believe that. I can't believe it either. But nonetheless, here we are. Anyway, guys, most of America, like I said, is back on track. There is still a lot of Wild West feel to America, But again, with the support of other nations, we were able to hold back the Chinese. Food production is back in. Farmers, there's more farmers now than there were before the EMP went off. So I guess that's a good thing. Americans are being fed again. Power is back. We're almost back to Wild West era. Because yes, we have ACs. There are some running cars. Car factories are trying to build cars, but they're building them at such a slow pace, it's almost not even worth waiting for a car. Horseback is the main transport for a lot of places. If you're in a bigger city and you're transporting, you have a vehicle. And you get this vehicle, interestingly enough, by way of applying for it through the government so that you can get a vehicle first, but you got to do government runs. So you're running from state to state, making sure certain things are in order, or you're supplying military and food throughout the nation. So that's the only two ways you can get a vehicle. Other than that, you're definitely riding a horse, or you're staying put to your local area unless you take a bus somewhere, or in some cases a plane, and even a plane, that's special permission because, again, not enough pilots. So other than that, guys, this is the Angry Prepper. Hope you liked the update, and thank you for watching.